Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives this afternoon. We're glad to have you with us today, whether you're here in the theater or watching us on C-SPAN or joining us on the Archives YouTube channel. Today we present a roundtable discussion related to the new volume in the Secretaries of Defense Historical Series, Melvin Laird and the Foundation of Post-Vietnam Military, 1969 to 1973. This volume highlights records from across the National Archives, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, one of 13 presidential libraries within the National Archives, holds Melvin Laird's papers on topics including the 1964 Republican Party platform, the 1964, 68, and 72 presidential campaigns, congressional Republicans in the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and a wide range of Defense Department procurement, planning, and policy issues, both regional and global. Other records consulted include records of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, records of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as well as many different record series from the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and the Presidential Materials Staff. In 2012, we presented a discussion based on the previous volume in the series, and we're pleased to welcome back Dr. Aaron Mahan, Chief Historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who will moderate today's discussion. It's also a pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, the Honorable John Warner, former Secretary of the Navy and Senator from Virginia. Before I invite Dr. Mahan to the lectern, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up in the McGowan Theater this week. Tomorrow at noon, historian Michael Nyberg will be here to talk about his book, Potsdam, The End of World War II and the Remaking of Europe, and a book signing will follow the program. On Thursday, July 16th at 7 p.m., Alelia Bundles, chair of the National Archives Foundation, will moderate a Writers and Scholars Roundtable on Civil Rights, featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning authors Taylor Branch, Gilbert King, and Diane McWhorter. This program is presented in partnership with the March on Washington Film Festival. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it in regular mail or by email. Our moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Aaron R. Mahan, has been Chief Historian for the Office of the Secretary of Defense since 2010. Previously, she worked in the Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction at National Defense University and the Historian's Office at the U.S. Department of State, where she was an editor of the Foreign Relations of the United States series. Dr. Mahan holds a PhD in history from the University of Virginia, but her most important credential, as far as I'm concerned, is her service on the National Historical Preservation and Records Commission, which I chair here at the National Archives. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Aaron Mahan.
Thank you, David, for that kind introduction. And thanks to the National Archives for graciously providing this venue for the event and hosting the OSD Historical Office newest publication. I also want to thank Tom Nastic here at NARA, as well as members of my own staff, namely Corbin Williamson, Marshall Yokel, and Glenn Asner, for handling all the logistics. We on stage often know that these events are not possible without the hard work of those behind us, and they really make it happen. My own brief comments mirror David's because government history programs, such as ours in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, could not produce comprehensive books without the assistance of the National Archives, which processes and houses the voluminous primary documents used in our series. Our two organizations are natural partners in the construction of official histories. The goal of my little history shop inside the vast Pentagon bureaucracy is to produce books like this that we are recognizing today that are well-researched, balanced, and as much as possible objective narratives that will stand the test of time. To that end, we are writing them about 4 decades after the period they cover so that we can make use of the resources as they finally get declassified, or at least that's what I tell my bosses when they ask why they take so long. especially when it's 40 years behind the curve. But that necessary time lag also precluded Secretary Melvin Laird from being here himself. He's no longer able to travel, but I'm very pleased that his son, David Laird, and his grandson, Harry, were able to be with us today. Thank you for coming. Melvin Laird is the first living Secretary of Defense to have one of our official volumes published during his lifetime. And some say that the secret to longevity is the cultivation of a lifetime of healthy relationships. And that is very true of Melvin Laird. Richard Hunt's Melvin Laird and the Foundation of the Post-Vietnam Military, 1969 to 1973, is the 7th volume in our Secretaries of Defense historical series. The series obviously focuses on the Secretary, but also on the wider Office of the Secretary of Defense and their combined role in developing national security policy. We think Dr. Hunt's book is a great addition to our series. His book focuses heavily on the final years of the Vietnam War, and in particular on the implementation of Vietnamization. But his book also addresses other major subjects, such as Laird's attempt to reorient the department on the core security challenge of the Soviet Union, his struggles with recapitalizing a worn-out force in the face of a shrinking budget, and a host of critical personnel issues from the end of the draft and implementation of the all-volunteer force to making the services a most hospitable environment for women and minorities. I turn now to our keynote speaker, the Honorable John Warner. Senator Warner is one of those rare individuals who served on active duty in both the Navy and the Marine Corps. Having experience in both elements of the naval services perhaps made sense that he would one day end up being Secretary of the Navy under Secretary Laird. Ultimately, he was elected to the Senate, where he served for 30 years as either member or chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Last, and certainly not least, he is one of those very rare living individuals to have a Navy ship named after him. The USS John Warner, appropriately a Virginia-class nuclear attack submarine, was christened just last September and delivered a few weeks ago, 3 months ahead of schedule. We very much appreciate his participation today, given his firsthand perspective on Secretary Laird. Thank you, Senator Warner, for those. Well, we're going to thank you in a minute, but I want to turn the stage over to you now.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming and attending. I'm particularly grateful to the archivist. As I expressed to him, I worked my way through law school partially by working in the law library. My wages were $1.25 an hour. And to the distinguished historian of the Department of Defense and her wonderful staff who've, together with others, put this book together, thank you. And I say thank you from my heart because this was an incredible chapter of American history that you had to record and do it with accuracy and preserve it for future generations. We have two other distinguished guests here tonight that are, and I did guess it's morning, Secretary of Navy Charles Bowser and General Persley. Do I see you right there, both of you? I'll, during question and answer period, maybe put a question to you because you stood beside Laird. This man, Mel Laird, was bigger than life. I hear from him frequently, and I dutifully called him yesterday to have a final discussion about several points I wanted to discuss, and he promptly agreed to them all, said, fine. I said, do you have any final thoughts? Yes, I do. Long pause. Warner, don't screw up. That was characteristic of his leadership in the Department of Defense. Yes, he was a rough, tough, swaggering old destroyer officer in World War II, receiving the Purple Heart. But when it came to the administration of that building, he had that wonderful management of skill of knowing where firmness had to be applied, where compassion was needed, and where those needed help. And he was, together with a man he absolutely loved, David Packard, formed the Laird Packard team, and we entered that building in January of 1969. Now, mind you, Mel Laird, in his lifetime, of course, he had his naval command experience at sea, but other than that, his largest responsibility of staff was somewhere between 30 to 40 to 50 staff people on Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill was his love of life. Let it be no mistake, next to his family, his love of life. And he would often sneak out of the building, as Richard Capon, one of the assistants he had that worked with us, used to tell me, to ostensibly go to Capitol Hill for a haircut. But we all knew that he was going back up there to take the pulse of the Congress. And when I say the Congress, it was a bipartisan approach. He didn't just go to his Republicans, he went to the Democrats, and he took with him the confidence that what he was trying to do was in the best interest of the whole nation. And it was not a partisan challenge that he was posing. That was one of his greatest skills. And it reflected by Secretary Bowser, whom he asked to stay on. Bowser had been with the Democratic administration, appointed by the Democratic administration. But Mel Laird, skillfully, in putting together that team, decided to retain 6 or 8 persons who had been under McNamara, Clark Clifford, to stay there because of their skills. Politics be damned. Let's get the best and most knowledgeable of skills to run this department at a time of critical history being made. At a time where the first week in office, an aide pulled him to the side and said, "Mr. Secretary, the casualty figures for last week in Vietnam were over 500 killed." That was the greeting he received when he arrived. That put him on a mission to do everything our country could possibly do to resolve the conflict in Vietnam, and at the same time keep focus on the emerging picture of the threats facing America in the future. Now, mind you, this was the Cold War period, and the Soviet Union was challenging the United States on the high seas all over the world. I was privileged to have been given the task by Laird and Secretary of State Bill Rogers to go and, right in the middle of the Cold War, travel to Moscow on a number of occasions and negotiate with the Soviets an executive agreement so that our ships wouldn't collide trying to collect intelligence on each other, or the airplanes wouldn't crack up and precipitate a greater conflict that was not the intentions of either the Soviet Union or the United States. That was Europe. Pacific, of course, was focused on the conflict in Vietnam. So this man gave up what he loved most, the Congress of the United States, full knowing if he did his job right, he would never be able to return again and probably survive a public election. But he took that and he agreed to stay for 4 years. And I am deeply humbled and privileged to have been by his side in all those 4 years. Apart from our formal relationship, we had a bit of a social relationship, and it was an interesting one, just to give you an example of the intensity with which this man would work. He'd ring me up, we all worked on Saturday mornings. He'd say, "Warner, we're going to have mission number 2 this afternoon, leaving here promptly at 3 o'clock. Yes, sir. I'll be ready. 3 o'clock, I'd be down in his limousine with Pappas out to a golf course where we would play golf. And then after golf, he would have one drink. It was a Manhattan. And then he would get back in the limousine with me. He would go back to the Department of Defense. I'd grab my car and scoot home and stay there and work in solitude or with others well into the night. 7 days, 7 nights a week, this man labored. And it's laid forth in this excellent book. There's a chronology of all of the key things that he achieved and he was proud in. But most all, I think, was the all-volunteer force. He felt very strongly that such draft mechanisms as we had at that time were inequitable. Such things as the inability of women and minorities to advance through the ranks of the military needed to be adjusted. And he felt that if he could take the gamble and convince America that the concept of volunteerism, which goes back to the earliest days of our republic, that concept would glue together this nation and bring about an even stronger military. Now, folks, those of us who were there during this period as we were formulating and testing the various chances to do this, and the military stood back in awe and said, this is going to be a high risk. But it was Melvin Laird's determination to try it that drove it through, and it took root. And today I can testify, having spent 30 years in the United States Senate, supporting it, funding it, it has worked and exceeded all expectations. The vision, the courage of one man to make that decision. There are many others that I could recount, but today we're going to have a full discussion. Other persons far more informed on this book than I will address you. But I simply want to close by saying that you've got to remember at that point in time, 360 degrees of critics circled the Department of Defense. Laird had to continuously debate, I'll use that word, there's a stronger word, but I have to restrain myself, with the Department of State. He had to deal with the Congress, knowing that one vote on some missile program, one vote on something else could cripple and pull apart his matrix of thinking to guide America on beyond Vietnam to meet the challenges of the world. He really never lost a single important vote in his 4 years in the Congress. Again, because he would slip up and get his hair cut and sit there just man to man or man to woman with his colleagues he knew best, urging them to repose in him the confidence to make these decisions. He even had to take on the White House. How well I remember that. I had been associated with the Nixon campaign team for 2 elections, the 60 and the 68. But he said to his staff in the Pentagon, I and I alone will do the congressional relations with the White House. None of you are to be over there unless you're specifically carrying in your pocket an authorization slip signed by me to go. And that, in the end, was to this individual, a great protection. I won't go into the detail on that. Laird reminded me yesterday, Warner, I saved you from extinction. Yes, sir. Anyway, this is a momentous event. Each of us are a part of it, and I now respectfully and humbly yield the floor to our framework of speakers, and perhaps I'm joining them. Is that correct? I'm joining them up here. But thank you all once again for joining us, and I hope we have a good, lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warner, for your very incisive remarks. I'd now like to move to the next phase of our program and invite our other speakers to the podium. In the order. So let me now introduce our very distinguished panelists who will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, allowing time for questions from the audience. And during that phase, I do ask that you find one of the standing microphones on either side of the auditorium to pose your question. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeremy Surrey, who holds a distinguished chair in global leadership at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Surrey is an expert on the time period covered in the Laird volume. The author of 6 books, including the widely acclaimed Henry Kissinger and the American Century, published by Harvard University Press in 2007, he has recently published a new edited volume entitled Foreign Policy Breakthroughs, Cases in Successful Diplomacy, recently released by Oxford University. Dr. Surrey and I were contemporaries in graduate school, and I can say that I long ago predicted what the Smithsonian Magazine named him, which is one of the top young innovators in the arts and sciences. It is truly a privilege to have him here today. Professor Surrey's remarks will be followed by Dr. George Herring, Professor Emeritus at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Herring is a prolific historian on American foreign relations and one of our profession's foremost scholars on the Vietnam War. No graduate student passes through a doctoral program without reading his highly acclaimed standard survey of the conflict, America's Longest War, the United States and Vietnam, 1950 to 1975, which is in its 4th edition. Professor Herring has also won countless awards and fellowships, including those from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Fulbright program. Our third panelist is the author of the book, Dr. Richard Hunt. Given that the Vietnam War was front and center during Secretary Laird's tenure, Dr. Hunt's scholarly background made him a logical selection. He served as a historian with the Army, and while on active duty, he was assigned to the Military Assistance Command Vietnam History Office. Then as a civilian historian for the U.S. Army Center of Military History, he worked on historical studies of the Vietnam War. His most notable book, before this one, of course, is Pacification, The American Struggle for Vietnam's Hearts and Minds, which analyzes the U.S. South Vietnamese effort to stem the Viet Cong insurgency. I now turn the floor and the microphone, or you can speak from the floor if you, from your chair if you prefer, Dr. Surrey.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, an honor to be on stage with a senator who I revere and 2 historians who have been models for me in many ways, but most importantly to be here with my friend Erin Mahan. Erin has done more, I think, for public history than almost any other historian. She brings a seriousness to her work, which is so important, and she does a great job, I think an unmatched job, of connecting the world of scholarship with the world of policymaking, and that's really what we're about here. I also want to say how glad I am to be here to talk about Secretary Laird. I had the opportunity to talk to him on a number of occasions. I used to teach at the University of Wisconsin before I moved to the University of Texas, and Secretary Laird was very generous with me on many occasions. He even blurbed my book about Henry Kissinger, which was actually quite a story because his relationship with Henry Kissinger is not always the nicest of relationships, and it was interesting how that happened. But I learned so much from Secretary Laird, and I'm very honored to be here with members of his family, and please tell him that I said that. I want to really raise a couple of points about this terrific book that Richard has produced for us here. Mel Laird and the Foundations of the Post-Vietnam Military in the United States is a book that takes us through what I think is one of the most important turning points, and this is a point that the senator made, one of the most important turning points in American military and political strategy, and also one of the most important turning points in American society. And the American military was one of the places where American social change occurred. Part of this book is about not just the Vietnam War, but also the changing composition of the U.S. military, the changing role of the U.S. military in American society, the struggles with drugs and race in the American military, as well as the struggle with fighting a war in Vietnam. I want to raise 3 issues for us to think about today, 3 areas where I think this book enlightened my thinking and where it can enlighten all of us and hopefully give us some more issues to discuss in our conversation that'll follow. First issue, what is the role of the Secretary of Defense? What role should the Secretary of Defense play? Of course, when the office was created in 1947 with the National Security Act, it was a major change in the American Constitution. I have to remind students of this all the time, that the Constitution speaks of a War Department, right, and a Navy Department, that we've had a War and a Navy Department from really the 1780s through the 1940s. And that, of course, I have to remind students there was no Air Force at that point early on. They sometimes forget that. And the National Security Act of 1947 creates the Unified Secretary of Defense, the Unified Office. What role does the Secretary of Defense play? What this book shows, I think, better than anything else I've read, is that the Secretary of Defense, in Laird's case, played a major role not simply as a policy advisor to the President, but actually as a policy leader for Congress. The role that Laird played in educating the Congress, in informing the Congress, in making the Congress part of the policy process. This is something the Senator referred to. I think it was much more than just haircuts, obviously. This book brings that out quite forthrightly. Laird spent time not simply at Congress, but also time managing the military bureaucracy, which by this point had become the largest bureaucracy, of course, in the United States and in the world, with his partner, Deputy Secretary of Defense David Packard. Together, they set a model for public information and policymaking in line with the other branches of Congress. And if I might say so, it appears to me, reading this volume, that often they were replacing the reporting role that the National Security Council or the White House might have otherwise played. At times, the Defense Department became the primary information source for the Congress and for the American public. And the book goes through a number of cases where this is true, Cambodia and Laos being 2 of many. What role should the Secretary of Defense play? What role should he have within the White House national security establishment? For Nixon and Kissinger, Laird was a secondary policymaker at best. It's not that he wasn't accessible to the President, it's that they often made policy, as the book shows, without attention to his opinions or with ignoring his opinions. And Laos would be another example of that time and again. Where should the Secretary of Defense fit into the policy process? What role should he play? The volume shows that Laird found a way to get his policy positions into the policy process, but he often had to do it despite the White House. Despite the White House. Second point, Vietnam. George, I'm sure, will talk a lot more about this. I think the book makes a very strong case that Laird was not only the author of the Vietnamization strategy, that we knew, I think, but that he made an important effort time and again to pressure and in many cases to force other members of the administration to follow through on this process, and that he played a key role in trying to build up the South Vietnamese military. The book is very strong on showing Laird's budgetary efforts to get allocations of resources from a Congress that did not want to allocate resources to these purposes. It shows repeatedly how he tried to stand in the way of escalatory moves that were advocated by Kissinger and the JCS and others. And in fact, to my astonishment, it shows at times where the JCS tried to undermine Laird's activities in this area. You could argue that at times the Vietnamization policy that Laird was pursuing was up against the odds of almost every other policymaker in the White House at the time. And I think the book shows very well that the de-escalation of American forces, which I think was crucial to removing the United States from the war, the turning over of the fight to the South Vietnamese, was something Laird played an instrumental role in. I think it's also clear in the book, though others might disagree with me on this, it's pretty clear that Laird did not expect the South Vietnamese force to be able to fight successfully on its own. I think one of the lies we tell ourselves now is that the South Vietnamese military could have survived and could have won without the United States. I think the Vietnamization strategy was a strategy of withdrawal, and it was a strategy of the South Vietnamese government ultimately collapsing. And I think Laird recognized that. That's not said in the book. That's my interpretation of what's in the book. Final point, the all-volunteer force. I agree with Senator Warner on this, and reading this book, I would argue that Chapter 14, the chapter on the all-volunteer force, is worth the price of the book unto itself. That chapter, I think, provides the best account I have seen of the politics behind the creation of the all-volunteer force. I learned so much reading that chapter alone. It shows how crucial Laird was in managing the Gates Commission, which was, of course, the Blue Ribbon Commission created to look into the all-volunteer force. It shows his role working with Martin Anderson in the White House, George Shultz, Milton Friedman, and others, things you would not expect a Secretary of Defense to do. It shows quite conclusively how important the pay increase was, the 20% pay increase that was given to military servicemen and women, the lottery, the use of the lottery, and the end of draft calls on July 1973. The volume shows that Laird recognized, as Senator Warner said so well, that the American military would fight better and that there would be a better relationship between the U.S. military and the American public if it moved from what was a somewhat arbitrary and unfair draft system to an all-volunteer system. And he managed that process. But I was also moved by a particular passage in the book, and I want to read. This is the only thing I'll read from Richard's book, but I want to read this passage because it captures some of my own reservations. I think the reservations many historians have about the all-volunteer force. This is at the end of a long chapter by our author about the all-volunteer force, showing how successful Laird was with it, but it raises important questions for us today. Questions I ask myself when I look out at my undergraduates at the University of Texas today, very few of whom, unless they're in ROTC, have served in the military. This is the author. Should military service be regarded as a commodity, as the economists believed, or did an individual have an obligation to one's country that transcended economic considerations? The end of the draft, pioneered by Laird, raised profound issues about freedom and the obligations of citizenship. Young Americans now had the freedom once again to choose not to serve and to plan their lives without fear of being drafted. The nation would have to wage war with volunteers. That's what we've done. With no shared obligation for military service from the larger society, the military henceforth would be a force of professionals who alone would bear the physical and emotional costs of fighting. Persons outside the military would be spared for most of the hardships and consequences of war, and as a result might have less personal interest in opposing or protesting an unpopular or unjust conflict. I think we've seen the evidence of that. There's much more ambivalence, much more disinterest in our wars because most of our young people are not serving in those wars, at least most of those who we see on university campuses. The issues that arose when conscription ended in 1973 had also been debated in 1917. Others at the time protested that conscription would erode the traditional American ideals of individual freedom and volunteerism. The lesser engagement of the public in initiating and conducting war conferred on the nation's leaders, particularly the president, greater discretion in making decisions about war and peace. With the end of conscription in 1973, the all-volunteer force would constitute a test of whether the needs of national security during the Cold War could be met without recourse to conscription. And I think as Senator Warner said, and as the book shows very well, the United States military became a better fighting force as an all-volunteer professional force. But the question, of course, for us is, did we become a better society? Did we become a better society? I am moved by this account of Secretary Laird's time at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, by his commitment to public service, by his mastery of the issues, by his recognition and deep belief in the democratic process. That's what he was doing at Congress. But I'm also struck by what a different world it is from today. What a different world it is from today in the relationship between citizens and government, in the relationship between parties and governance, and most significantly, in the public engagement with these issues. I wish we had people like Secretary Laird back, because I think our policy is less fruitful, less well thought out, less effective, because we lack leaders of that kind today. Thank you.
My thanks, too, to Aaron and the Historical Office for having me here today. I welcome the opportunity to say good things about a book from which I learned a great deal, and in this case about a public servant I have come to have a real liking for. Now, I've been teaching and writing history for 50 years, and I think looking back on it that what has kept me going more than anything else is the people I have taught and written about. And one of my favorites happens to be Melvin Laird, the subject of today's gathering. I have to confess also that my historical acquaintance with Laird is recent and somewhat accidental. Not too many years ago, Jeremy Surrey invited me to talk about Laird at a symposium in Madison, and I must confess, when I accepted, I knew very little about him at that time. So I had to do a lot of work to educate myself, and the more I read, the more I came to see what an interesting character he was and to appreciate his vital role in the first Nixon administration. I don't need to emphasize in present company that the position of Secretary of Defense may be at least the second most difficult job in Washington. And we know it took a huge toll on many of its occupants: James Forrestal, Louis Johnson, Robert McNamara. Clark Clifford served less than a year and later commented that his less than 12 months seemed like 5 years. Laird brought extraordinary credentials to the office. Member of Congress for 16 years with long service on the House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. He was an adept bureaucratic operator. President-elect Nixon worried on one occasion about his appointee's reputation for being, say, at least a tad devious. Of course Laird is devious, former President Eisenhower assured him, but for anyone who has to run the Pentagon and get along with Congress, that is a valuable asset. In his memoirs, Henry Kissinger readily concedes his admiration for Laird's skills as a political infighter. The Nixon administration, of course, could be a den of plots, conspiracies, and backbiting that makes the word Byzantine seem benign by comparison, and Laird more than held her own. There are many stories, and I'll tell just one of them here. One of my favorites: Kissinger typically sought to exclude Laird from a presidential meeting with the Pope, but protocol called for Nixon to fly on a military aircraft from St. Peter's to an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. So Laird brought the helicopter to St. Peter's an hour before Nixon was due to arrive. Given the noise level below, the Pope couldn't help but observe the aircraft, so he invited its passengers inside. Imagine Kissinger's shock when he arrived and found Laird already there. Kissinger concedes in his memoirs that in tangles with Laird he lost as often as he won. He also concedes that Laird operated with a buoyancy and good humor that made working with him as satisfying as it could be on occasion maddening. I think maybe that's in my heart of hearts why I've taken a liking to Laird. Now, it's an impression of mine, nothing I've measured scientifically, that until very recently Laird has not got his due. The index to the first edition of my book, America's Longest War, for example, contains but 2 citations to Laird, both references to his and William Rogers' unsuccessful opposition to presidential initiatives. Richard Hunt's history of Laird's stewardship of the Pentagon, I think, is a superb corrective. It's most impressively researched. I'm one of those weird characters, maybe some others of you out there, who sometimes reads footnotes for fun. Imagine that. As I was pursuing the notes of this volume, I could only envy the citation of documents I assume are still unavailable to me. The book is well organized and clearly written. It upholds what I have come to view as the high standards of the series. It persuasively argues the centrality of Melvin Laird's role in national security policy in Nixon's first administration. Obviously, in the time allowed here, I can't deal with everything or indeed with many things, so let me just address a few matters where I'll focus will come as no surprise to anyone who knows my work. I was most impressed with Dr. Hunt's analysis of Laird's crucial part in Nixon's Vietnam policies. To understand his role at that time, I think it's useful to begin with the Johnson presidency. At the time LBJ Americanized the war, 50 years ago this month, Laird was one of his most vocal critics. Hunt sees Laird in one comment as neither hawk nor dove. I see him at this point in 1965 as a Goldwater hawk who firmly believed in the efficacy of air power and in the concept of win or get out. In 1965, he advocated expanded bombing of North Vietnam. He staunchly opposed increasing U.S. ground forces. And when Johnson was contemplating doubling the number of U.S. forces in June-July 65, Laird urged Republicans to withhold support unless the president told them what he was up to. Fat chance of that happening at that time. Laird was also challenging the more moderate and compliant Jerry Ford for leadership of House Republicans. So in 1965 in the summer, I've been working with LBJ's phone conversations, and Laird appears briefly but prominently. Fascinating phone conversation with Ford, June of 1965. LBJ suggested half-jokingly, only half-jokingly, that Laird was off his rocker and urged Ford to put a muzzle on him. To ingratiate himself with Ford, the president then proposed that his dissident Senator Wayne Morse be traded to the Republicans for Mel Laird. As Secretary of Defense, Laird, has already been mentioned, was the architect of and even coined the name for the policy of Vietnamization. His major accomplishment, Hunt contends, was getting the United States out of Vietnam, and the book documents with rich detail how he did this. His single-minded commitment to troop withdrawals often put him at odds with President Nixon, who I think appreciated fully the political importance of what Laird was doing, but also had some problems with it, and Henry Kissinger, who did not always appreciate it. They persisted in seeking peace with honor, code words for an independent, non-communist South Vietnam. Their negotiating position called for mutual withdrawal of U.S. and North Vietnamese troops. They hoped to use troop withdrawals as a bargaining lever with Hanoi. Laird viewed the war mainly from the perspective of domestic politics. He was certain it could not be won. He saw his task as getting the United States out as quickly as possible and repairing the damage at home caused by the war. By the fall of '69, through skillful maneuvers, he had brought the United States to what Dr. Hunt calls the verge of irreversible unilateral withdrawal. And from this point, he employed all the tricks of his trade to get U.S. forces out of Vietnam as quickly as possible. He used mounting pressure to cut the military budget as leverage to speed the pace of withdrawals. Time again, he outmaneuvered Kissinger and even Nixon on withdrawal policy, provoking Nixon aide Al Haig to accuse him of management chicanery. Laird was convinced, Hunt concludes, that there could be no detours or slowdowns in seeking to end U.S. combat in Vietnam. While getting Americans out, of course, he also pushes hard to prepare South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting. Laird's dogged and ultimately successful pursuit of troop withdrawal and Vietnamization raises, I think, some interesting questions, some difficult problems. It certainly provides another example of the dysfunctionality of the Nixon administration. With a stronger president, or maybe a weaker Secretary of Defense, might not have happened. I am certainly in sympathy with Laird's urge to get the United States out of Vietnam, but it's also clear that unilateral withdrawal did weaken Nixon's negotiating position and, as Jeremy suggested, South Vietnam's ability to survive. I'm not sure of it, but my sense is that he dealt with this contradiction by persuading himself, despite abundant evidence to the contrary, that Vietnamization would work, that the South Vietnamese would be able to defend themselves. If this was his belief, of course, he turned out to be wrong, and he clung to this belief even after, in 1974-75, Vietnam's deficiencies became all too obvious. In his interesting 2005 article on Vietnam and Iraq, he blames the fall of Saigon on the U.S. Congress cutting aid to South Vietnam, a charge that I've never been convinced by. Now, I thought the Laos chapter was a particularly fascinating piece of work which reveals a whole lot of things. The dysfunctionality of the administration's policymaking process. Above all, Lam Son 719, Hunt concludes, raised basic questions about the accomplishments and the durability of Vietnamizations, as well as the competence of the two governments to wage war on its own. What I think has to be remembered, and I would add quickly and emphatically on this point, that this excellent book deals with a lot more than the wars in Southeast Asia, and that, I think, is its real strength, bringing to the fore things that aren't usually taken into account in the history of these years. I think from the standpoint of time, I will stop right there and stop with a conclusion which I was particularly drawn to, and I think particularly well sums up what we're talking about today. Here's the way Hunt sums it up. Laird, he said, exercises considerable autonomy in a sometimes dysfunctional administration that sought to stifle him. Fortunately for Nixon and Kissinger, he goes on to say, they failed to stifle him. The book makes clear a public figure who has gained little notice, played a pivotal role in a number of key areas. He not only survived in a difficult post, but accomplished a great deal in an administration that often tried to marginalize him. He did it with clear vision, well-defined goals, dogged determination, and a large dose of good humor. My conclusion, not the author's, perhaps the smartest thing Laird did was to get out of Washington before the creaky edifice that was the Nixon administration came crashing down amidst the wreckage of Watergate. Thank you.
Very well done.
I would like to thank the organizers of this session, the many NARA archivists who helped me, and the two OSD historians who helped make this book possible. Before he retired, Al Goldberg gave me the opportunity to work on this project. The current historian, Aaron Mahan, provided unwavering support and sage advice. Melvin Laird was a reluctant secretary, but a major figure in Nixon's first term. He advised the president-elect in 1968 to nominate Democratic Senator Henry Jackson for the post. When Jackson backed out, Nixon turned to Laird. Laird accepted on condition that Nixon let him appoint his own officials. To Laird's surprise, Nixon agreed. Laird exercised this authority throughout his tenure. For his deputy, Laird selected David Packard without first notifying the president-elect. When informed, Nixon raised no objections, but was somewhat dismayed because he had recruited Packard for a cabinet-level position, but was turned down. He wrote Laird in 1972, quote, "I struck out," end quote. Perhaps no single appointment was more important to DoD in this period than that of Packard. Among other things, he handled acquisition reform and the preparation of defense budgets. Laird entered office intent upon disengaging from the conflict. He planned to withdraw U.S. forces from Vietnam while improving and modernizing South Vietnam's military so it could become capable of continuing the struggle against North Vietnam on its own. This became known as Vietnamization. Laird's other major objective was to prepare U.S. armed forces for the post-war period. Vietnam was costly in lives, money, equipment, and political capital. Support for defense programs declined sharply during Nixon's first term. In addition, the war delayed modernization of weapons and equipment and weakened relations with Asian and European allies. Under Robert McNamara, the Pentagon had shifted troops, equipment, and ammunition to Vietnam from other commands, including NATO, weakening readiness. Years of Vietnam combat severely frayed the force, exposing racial divisions and growing drug abuse. Disaffection in the ranks weakened morale and discipline. Laird and Nixon set up programs to improve opportunities for women and minorities and to provide education, amnesty, and drug rehabilitation programs to help those with addiction problems. To build the future force, Laird worked to end the draft and establish an all-volunteer force. Laird served during a period of shrinking budgets, anti-military sentiment, and serious inflation. Pentagon critics called for greater spending on social programs and less on defense. This environment made rebuilding the defense program even more challenging. The armed forces declined by a third during his tenure, from $3.4 million in fiscal year 1969 to $2.2 million in fiscal year 1973. The President and Congress steadily cut spending. Outlays fell from $78 billion in FY69 to about $73 billion in FY73. But measured in inflation-adjusted dollars, outlays declined by 27%. Thanks in part to his political skills, Laird was able to fend off the even more severe cuts many in Congress sought to impose. Laird forged his basic views on national security as a congressman. He had grown uneasy over President Johnson's Vietnam policy. To Laird, the war weakened the U.S. economy and its armed forces and was peripheral to core security interests. U.S. involvement in the war provided an opportunity for the Soviet Union to enhance its conventional and strategic power. Moreover, Johnson's policies had produced a stalemate in Vietnam and needlessly wasted lives and treasure. From the start of the administration, Kissinger and Nixon believed that increased battlefield pressure could facilitate a negotiated settlement. They wanted the Joint Chiefs of Staff somehow to intensify Vietnam operations without alienating the public. Laird disagreed. Ever sensitive to domestic reaction, he argued that the public expected the war to wind down, more aggressive operations would increase American casualties and cause a further loss of political support. After Laird's trip to South Vietnam in March '69, he recommended that President Nixon accelerate and expand plans to upgrade South Vietnam's forces. The operative plans only prepared South Vietnam's military to cope with Viet Cong guerrillas. If American troops were to withdraw, South Vietnam needed to be capable of fighting North Vietnam's regular forces as well. At the end of March 1969, Nixon embraced Vietnamization, expanding the U.S. program to grow and modernize South Vietnam's forces so that they could bear the full burden of combat. Laird advocated Vietnamization as militarily feasible and politically pragmatic. It was his major policy contribution. He assumed that the new administration had a short breathing spell before war critics resumed their attacks. Laird doubted a negotiated settlement could materialize before public and congressional opposition became irresistible. Under Vietnamization, South Vietnam's armed forces doubled in size to over 1 million, while the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam dropped from 540,000 in 1969 to under 24,000 at the time the Paris Peace Agreement was signed in January 73. By the way, January 73 also saw the end of conscription and Laird's departure from office. Laird had agreed in 1969 to serve just for 4 years. He offered his resignation to the president in November 1972, effective 20 January 1973. In accepting the resignation, Nixon paid tribute to the secretary, calling him, quote, the indispensable man, the right man at the right place at the right time, end quote. No doubt the president was thinking of Laird's efforts to fend off catastrophic budget cuts, his handling of morale and social problems in the armed forces, his role in ending conscription, and most of all, the change in policy in Vietnam that led to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Thanks in part to Laird's efforts, Vietnam did not become a major political liability for Nixon in the 1972 presidential election. U.S. forces in Vietnam had shrunk to a small number, draft calls were down, and the public had less reason to protest. Even Kissinger, Laird's rival, praised him, quote, saying, quote, he preserved the sinews of our strength and laid the basis for expansion. This was a major achievement, end quote. Laird's successors would not have to wage war in Vietnam, but would have to ensure that the all-volunteer force remained viable, prepared to fight, and that it provided equal opportunities for minorities and women. Laird's measures to improve race relations, increase opportunities for women in the military, and handle the drug issue represented initial solutions to issues that would require more extensive resolution over time. However, those policies helped establish a foundation for Nixon's second term. On Vietnam, there was no firm foundation. The collapse of South Vietnam's forces in 1975 raised questions about the real accomplishments of Vietnamization. Despite the U.S. withdrawal, there was no resolution of the rancorous disagreements over the Vietnam War. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Well, all of our panelists have provided very thoughtful observations about an important book and an important man and the implications of many of his legacies. They've also done a very good job of allowing ample time for you to ask questions. We have about 30 minutes. If you run out of questions, I can fill that gap. But please go to the microphone and ask away.
Let me start a question.
Okay.
I think each of us in this room recognize that democracy is not a spectator sport, and it's tough. In my 30 years in the Senate, I've watched the Congress go from a fairly friendly working relationship in times of election, bitter partisanship, that's all right, it goes with the job. But when the elections are over, to try and reconcile and find a common ground for the common benefit of this great nation. And that has been a struggle, and I think in many ways the Congress has not succeeded. But Melvin Laird, to me, stands out as a single individual that could take the partisanship and deal with it, and then bipartisanship management in his own building. And I'd like to ask Charles Bowser, why did you agree, because you had a distinguished career before coming to the Pentagon and a distinguished career after, that you were willing to continue to stay and serve 3 more years with the Republicans? That got your attention, didn't it?
Come to the podium.
First, let me say it was a surprise that they asked me to stay. I was a Democrat from Chicago. You know, if you grew up in Chicago right after World War II, you either voted Democrat or you didn't get your garbage picked up or your snow removed in the wintertime. So we were all Democrats, and I came in there under McNamara. I was the last presidential appointment by McNamara, and then I did that 1 year, as John points out, and then when the Republicans came in, I was out in Chicago negotiating to go back with my firm, and I got this call from my Marine aide, Colonel Kaufman, who said, "Do you know Governor Chafee of Rhode Island?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, keep negotiating." And so I didn't expect. I came back. We had lunch with Chafee. He asked to see us individually, and when he came in to see me, he said, "Would you stay for a few weeks? Because I don't have a financial guy in that, and I'd like you to stay." So I arranged to do that, but I really soon found that the Laird, Packard, Chafee, Warner team was really terrific, and they were on the right course, because getting out of Vietnam, I think, was essential. I told a story yesterday over at the Pentagon that when Secretary Clifford did not approve General Westmoreland's request for 200,000 more troops after Tet, why, I got a call from Major General Chason, who you remember. He was kind of like the third ranking general at Marine headquarters, and he had been Westmoreland's chief of operations in Vietnam, so he knew it very well. He said to me on the phone, he said, "The Commandant would like me to come over and explain this situation a little more to you. Would you have time?" And of course I said I did, but then as soon as I hung up, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be interesting. So I got my Marine Colonel Kaufman again in, and I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Oh, I think he's coming over to tell you that the Secretary of Defense should have supported the general in the field, and he shouldn't have given him approval for the 200,000. Well, when General Chason came over, he folded out the map of Vietnam, pointed out that north to south, Vietnam was as long as the Russian front was east to west. And the idea of putting 200,000 more troops in there, and as he says what we would do, is probably have 100,000 in logistics and 100,000 in combat, would not in any way bring this war to a victory for America. We think the Secretary of Defense has made the right decision. So I saw then that beginning of the military beginning to think it was the better way was to come out as best we could and try to build up in it. And I thought Laird and Packard and Chafee and Warner, they were a terrific team, so I stayed 3 years.
How many of other Democrats stayed on? I think I can
Well,
count
quite a
5
few.
or
There was
6.
8 of us that were
8,
asked to
yeah.
stay on by Laird out of 30.
Out of 30, yeah.
Yeah, and that was like Johnny Foster and Bob Frosch with us.
Moot?
The controller. He kept the whole financial team.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he knew he had to, a lot of people that come in from the business world don't realize that in the government, one of the ways you get final decision on whatever you're trying to do is getting it through the Congress and the budget, the appropriation. But Mel knew that quite well. And so he didn't want to start over, I think, with inexperienced team there in that. But anyway, and to this day, I feel the 3 years I spent as part of this team was one of the greatest periods of my career, and I've had a great career in both the business community and in my 15 years as Controller General, too, at AGO. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Sir?
Yes. One of the things that the speakers focused on was the tensions between the Nixon White House and Laird. But I was wondering if there could be any comment about the tensions between Laird and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because it seems to me, from what I've read at least, there were occasions that the Joint Chiefs were going behind Laird's back and dealing with the White House, and the White House was very definitely encouraging that.
You go ahead. Well, first I want to start off. Constitutionally, the United States follows a firm principle of civilian control of the military. Now, when the Laird team comes in, or whether it's the team that comes in with the next president, you suddenly bring together men and women from the civilian environments that they've been in, presumably successful, and all of a sudden you got an enormous responsibility. Laird had 50 members of his staff on the Senate office and committee. He inherited 4 million staff, civilian workers, and military people overnight when he took that job. So the point I wish to make, you've got to rely on the military to recognize you're the boss, but at the same time develop a partnership with them. And like any two organizations, there's going to be some friction and some little end run. But basically, this has served America since the time of George Washington, civilian control. But it's dependent on a strong bond and trust between the civilians and the military.
I would agree with the senator, and one of the things that struck me in this book, I mean, we knew some of this before, but Dr. Hunt's really been able to pull out a lot of detail. I think there are a number of occasions, I was just thumbing through to find them, where the Joint Chiefs either don't inform Secretary Laird of what they're doing or deceive him of what they're doing. Now, I understand that some of this is politics, but I think it's very worrisome when we see that, and very worrisome when an NSC advisor who is not confirmed by Congress is actually encouraging the Joint Chiefs to do this. And this includes double booking on different air missions, et cetera. I think this is a very worrisome thing, and it's something we should worry about when we have a unified military service that develops its own interests. Civilian control is crucial, and I take from this that we need to be more vigilant about that.
There are also times when the Joint Chiefs and Laird's office work together to try to figure out what's going on at the White House.
Right.
I mean, it works both ways to some extent.
Fair enough.
But the divide does get much worse as it goes on, because during the Easter offensive in particular, Laird is kind of odd man out, and is odd man out. Then Nixon is working with the Joint Chiefs, and sometimes not even with the Joint Chiefs. He's picking out certain people to handle certain aspects of particularly of the bombing of North Vietnam.
Well, it's interesting. Each of us that take on these positions have military assistants assigned to them. And believe me, they are pivotal to your successful operation of your respective responsibilities. I had such a fine group all through my career. General Persley, you were Mel Laird's military assistant. How did you watch him deal with this question of the Joint Chiefs not giving him full support?
We probably should come to the mic.
Here's the guy that knows more than. But you got a good interview with him. Yeah.
Well, Mel Laird was astute in so many ways, and he knew pretty well, just by experience, when somebody was trying to go around or and otherwise perhaps not play the game straight. The first experience I had with Mel Laird, and this was before he was sworn in, he sent Bill Baruti, one of his longtime assistants, over to talk to me about this relationship of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs having an envoy to the White House, and a young fellow that I had known had been doing that kind of a job repeatedly, and it was a physician that had ex officio just stood for quite some time, but it depended on the personality of the people and how loyal they were. But in any event, Mel's sending Bill Baruti over was to see if it wouldn't be a good idea to write a memo to Henry Kissinger, even before the new administration came in, to argue against having that envoy be part of the program. In other words, let's discontinue that. Mel knew the people coming into the White House well enough, the Haldeman's and the Ehrlichmans and so on, and he knew Henry Kissinger exceptionally well because he was the one who had hired Henry Kissinger to help him on the Republican platform in 1964. He had long memory and knowledge about Henry. So he thought we better not have this envoy back and forth. And Bill Verde and I put together a little memo, but it was one of the first things that Henry turned down. He thought that was a grand idea. But in any event, Mel's alert to those kind of things, and just that alertness and skill in handling people allowed him to handle that. Let me just say, carry that forward and run the reel forward to the strategic arm limitation talks where supposedly Gerald Smith was the main negotiator. Well, it was very clear that Henry Kissinger was the main negotiator. But Mel Laird was astute enough to hire Paul Nitze to be his counsel on the strategic arm limitation talks. And that was seminal because Paul Nitze could keep him informed of what the back channels really were. And he also had Noel Geiler at NSA, very skilled in letting him know. So it goes both ways.
Well, Noel was handling all the communications. He could read it.
Oh, yeah. Well, so the personality of the Joint Chiefs goes a lot along the line of the chairman. General Wheeler was no real problem at all. Admiral Moore was a very definite problem, and just by personality.
May I ask a question? Because we've been talking collectively, and Professor Siri, I'd like to correct you on that. We're not talking about the Joint Chiefs. It's not Elmo Zumwalt or John Ryan or Bill Westmore or Leonard Chapman it's Tom Moore. It's Admiral Tom Moore, and he's working with Undersecretary of Defense Kenneth Rush. They're doing the end runs around. I'd like Dr. Hunt and Dr. Suri to comment on that and how Moore is a towering figure, as Esmeralda and John Carlin have said. He was jointness before they ever even talked about jointness. He was a one-man J3. He'd disappear sometimes to execute policy and nobody could find him. Don't you think you understated Admiral Moore's role in this history by focusing so much on Secretary Laird? I mean, on Vietnam policy, Dr. Hunt.
I bring out, I think, quite a bit of Moore's end runs and his collusion with the White House and Henry Kissinger, and particularly in the operational chapters. That was, I would agree that Laird worked better with Wheeler, but Moore could be a real problem. In the episode, I mentioned in the book, there's an episode with Yeoman Radford and spying. I came across somewhere, I don't know, a memo, I think Nixon, rather Laird wrote to himself, trying to debate whether he should fire, Moore for this. But he's preempted. Laird gets a phone call on Christmas morning from the president, and it's kind of awkward because Laird started figuring out, well, why is this man calling me Christmas morning? And he wishes Laird a Merry Christmas, and then he says, well, I think, he goes on a little bit, and then he says, I think we ought to keep Moore in place. We don't want to disturb things. I trust Moore. So that was kind of, tied Laird's hands on that question. I would like to ask one comment to the point about the relationship with the Joint Chiefs. When Laird came in, he instituted this idea of participatory management and wanted to involve the Joint Chiefs in decision-making and budget decision to a greater extent than they had with McNamara. So I think he made an effort to work with the Joint Chiefs, as well as was wary about these private channels.
I guess the point I was making, I agree with everything that was said, but the point I was making was a slightly different one, right? When you have a president or an administration that discounts people who bring them opinions that are well-informed, that don't match with what they want to hear, and valorizes those who bring them opinions that speak to their preconceived notions, it creates a dangerous dynamic, a dynamic that I think actually undermines civilian control, even when it's the president doing that. Because in this case, you have the Secretary of Defense, who's thought deeply about these issues, telling the president and NSC advisor Kissinger what they don't want to hear, and they're looking to incentivize someone else with a uniform on to tell them what they want to hear. That's a very dangerous dynamic, it seems to me.
Do I have any more minutes left on my? Okay. Interestingly enough, a little vignette here. If you were to ask Mel today, name at least one mistake or thing that happened that you would have done differently for today. And it would be very much to this point. He regretted not nominating Leonard Chapman to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff rather than Admiral Moore. He had already arranged with Nixon to cause that to happen, and this was when the Marines, weren't even part of the Joint Staff, Joint Chiefs at that time. That would have made the rest of the operation with the Joint Staff and the Joint Chiefs a lot different if it had happened that way. Leonard Chapman was a very different personality, very trustworthy, and just an incredible military mind. So I think Mel would say that. If I might back up, if we could go back to something that came up during the discussions earlier with our very learned guest from academia here. It was my impression, and I would say this just as firmly as I can say it, that Mel Laird believed that if the objective in Vietnam is self-determination, that Vietnamization would work. And he believed that if we went through with the program and in ground forces, it was working. Where we fell down some was in the support on the air side that would have been needed, and if that could have been extended, he still believes to this day, I'm absolutely certain, that Vietnamization could have been a success and was a success. So it wasn't just a way of diminishing or getting out. Vietnamization, to Mel Laird, was a derivative of a much broader national security approach. Vietnamization was necessary in order to resolve a situation that was bleeding us, as our author has said, during the period of the Vietnam War, where roughly a third of our our defense budget was oriented toward things in Southeast Asia. The Soviet Union was catching up rapidly in many strategic ways. And Mel wanted to free resources to get us oriented back on enemy number one. Part of the national security strategy that Mel had in mind involved getting the resource, the very vital intangible resource of major public support. And the draft was just destroying us in that arena, and it was necessary to get that back. And so all volunteer force, and the start of a program, of a very artfully designed program to finally convince people that the all volunteer force was the most immediate and the best way to solve the ills of conscription. So
Well,
we
thank you,
started that.
General, very much. I appreciate that.
George or Jeremy, would you
Thank
like
you.
to respond?
Do you want to
more
finish?
Well,
about
no, I was
this?
just going to say that there were many other parts of this that were important.
The real problem from the time Nixon takes office is that you've got two conflicting things. Anything you do to try to improve the situation at home is likely to reduce your ability to deal with Vietnam. And things you do in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, are designed to help in Vietnam diminish support at home. And I don't know how you resolve that. I don't know if there was a resolution to it.
Well, perhaps not, but going ahead, I think one other major pillar of this was the introduction of arms control as a real strength in our whole national security posture. Up to that point, in 1969, most of arms control had been centering around controlling testing, and there were small baby steps, but the major big step was getting strategic arm limitation talks going, and a prerequisite for that was to have an ABM treaty and negotiation, and Mel single-handedly got that vote.
Yep.
So there were big major steps in this reviving the whole national security posture, of which Vietnamization was a big major seminal part, but it was just part. And he thought, I still think to this day, that could have succeeded.
Thank you, Bob. I think we have time for the last, at least two more questions, and you've been waiting very patiently, sir.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm curious, Secretary of Defense's Laird when he was selected and asked to take that position. What experience you know of what he relied on as far as counsel from other secretaries of defenses that came before him, and even if it was across partisan lines, if he relied on people for counsel during his term.
I can't hear the question.
So the question was, what other secretaries of defense did Secretary Laird rely on for counsel as he was preparing to take the office? Is that
right? What did that cause friendships or anything that his positions were swayed, whether they would be for or against what prior Secretary of Defense was before him or before them? I'm not sure if there's any background knowledge of that.
He had extensive discussions with Clifford, to help make the transition smooth, and Laird said that those went very well. He cultivated Clifford in his experience and kept, as has been pointed out, retained a number of Clifford's people in office.
It's interesting to add there that he and Clifford were kind of on the same page
Yep.
regarding Vietnam from the beginning, because Clifford in 1965 was hawkish on the bombing but opposed to sending additional ground troops. Clifford goes to Johnson, with Johnson to Camp David right before the final decision is made, and with uncanny prescience warns of 500,000 troops in Vietnam, 50 killed in action. Of course, Johnson goes the other direction, but his attitude at that point was really rather close to Laird's.
Here's a question from the naval historian in the crowd here. The Elmo Zumwalt, Admiral Zumwalt, is probably one of the most controversial CNOs we've had in naval history, and it occurs on Melvin Laird's watch. Obviously, Admiral Moore, Zumwalt was not his pick to be the CNO, and I see kind of Zumwalt personifying a lot of themes that we've discussed here as far as Vietnamization and the transition to the all-volunteer force and maintain that force structure. Could we discuss a little bit about the selection for Zumwalt? I believe it was he was Laird's man, and how Zumwalt reflected the themes we were talking about here in this book.
Well, I was sort of in the middle of that one, because John Chafee, and I never had a more valued friend in my life, he was an 18-year-old Marine grunt on Guadalcanal. He was then sent to officers' school and was a platoon leader at Okinawa. And then he stayed in the reserves like I did, and we all got called up again for another conflict in Korea. He was a wonderful man, but I got to be really careful here. He had a little bit of a liberal streak in him, and Mel Laird had a little bit of a liberal streak in him. That Wisconsin water, it produces.
we call that beer.
All right, all that beer and that string cheese and so forth. And I was very strongly, and I was 3 months away from taking over from Chafee when this dialogue was going on, and Laird brought me in because he realized that I would have to deal with the next CNO, of course. And I was pushing for Chick Clary. He was two-time Navy Cross winner in the submarine force in World War II. He'd come up through the ranks of the Navy, and he was vice chief under Tom Moore for years, and he knew how to deal with Tom Moore, and he would have made a remarkable, I think. And he was very beloved by the sailors and everything. But Bud Zumwalt had a mission, and we saw it develop early on when he took office. But I think it was that streak of liberalism. There was a fraction of it in Mel Laird and John Chafee, and they very nicely said, no, we're not going to take your candidate, but then he's your CNO to deal with it for years, as I did. So Zumwalt had his pluses and his minuses, like everybody else. And he'd proven himself in combat. He was in some tough battles in the Pacific. He was chief gunnery officer at one time aboard the USS Wisconsin. So that's all history. But he had an agenda, and it was, you know, it was beer, broads, and beards, and broads. It was his nickname, because he let the sailors drove their beards, and he was very anxious to a lot of things. But I gave him credit. He put his heart into it, and as best we could. I don't know that I answered your question, but I did take up a little time.
Would anyone else like to respond?
Well, I wanted to come back to Vietnamization if we have time.
Yeah, we do.
I'm
We have
having
a few
trouble
moments.
just sitting here and not saying something about this. I think, General Percy, I appreciate your comments, and I'm sure I've talked to Secretary Laird a little myself about this, and I know he believes that Vietnamization was working, and maybe he believed then it was working. But I actually think what we need to say is he had the courage to move forward with it, believing it was working, but willing to do it even if it wasn't going to work, which is to say even if South Vietnam was not going to stand, because Kissinger's criticism was always that it is not going to work. Later on, Kissinger changes his position on this. And I fear we've done a disservice to our society today when we don't tell Americans that sometimes a war we've been in, we have to get out of, even if we cannot sustain the regime we would like to sustain when we leave. And so we need to tell this history fairly. So yes, Secretary Laird thought it would work, but I give him credit for having the courage to do it, even if he wasn't absolutely certain it was going to work. And I don't think we should blame Congress for selling out a policy that I don't think was working in '75. I'm with George on this. I appreciate your insights on this. Thank you.
I think we actually have time for one more question. Are there any remaining ones?
And a quick answer.
If not, I'll let each of the speakers perhaps have one last word. Oh, okay, I guess we've covered
Well,
it.
I'll simply say it was a remarkable chapter in my life, and to the extent I went on to achieve anything, it was a foundational experience that enabled me to do what I did in later life. And when many years I was either chairman or ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, I'd call up old Mel. I'd say, Mel, I'm between a crack and a hard place here. Give me some of your thoughts. And he'd unload on me pretty big. But those of us who were blessed with the opportunity to serve with him, I mean, we'll always cherish those memories. And he just loved America and gave up everything to do that tough job. And more should be written about that transition between Nixon and bringing in Ford, which was a stroke of brilliance to bring Jerry Ford in. He had such a calming influence over America, and he began to gain trust. But of course, he was faced with a decision, and he did what was right with a pardon, and that, I think, ended his presidency. But he made it. Another example. He was a sailor. I remember him very well. He was on board carriers in World War II. And he just absolutely understood duty, honor, and country, even if it cost you your own ambitions.
I think that's a good note to end on. And this concludes our program. Dr. Hunt's book is available through GPO and is also available electronically on the OSD Historical website. Please join me again in thanking each of our speakers. Thank you for coming.
And we thank you.
Yes.
Well, gentlemen, I really enjoyed this.